What is imperialism? It's the policy of extending a country's power over another through diplomacy or military force. This is Cool Talk. Let's begin. Nations' populations continue to grow, and so does the need for raw resources and new resources during the Industrial Revolution, such as oil, coal, and gas. The world became a giant powder keg. We're going to examine imperialism in these areas: India, China, Japan, and the continents of Africa and Latin America, along with some other territories in Asia and the Pacific. Let's begin. In India in 1707, King Aurangzeb died. There was a power vacuum, and the Persians, taking advantage of the situation, invaded. Meanwhile, the English and the French, who already had trading posts in India, began a rivalry. Now, sick of these foreigners, in 1756, the Nawab governor of Bengal attacked the British of Calcutta. He imprisoned 146 Englishmen, put them in a small dungeon with no windows, and overnight, most of them had died of suffocation. When an Englishman named Robert Clive heard of this, he got angry, and he and some English forces attacked the Nawab people in Plassey. They became masters of Bengal. England disapproved of these companies like the East India Company having so much power, so they were supervised very closely. Nevertheless, the East English India Company joined forces with local rulers, and by the 1850s, they controlled all of India. Now, the Indians resented British control, especially the Christian missionaries who had come in to preach. Rebellions had broken out, and eventually the British abolished the East English India Company. They took over the country and appointed a viceroy, a first viceroy to govern British India, Lord Canning. Now, the British did bring down the crime rate, and they banned the practice of sati. Sati is that when a man dies, he's cremated, and his widow is expected to jump into the flames, burn to death, and be cremated with him. The British also banned the killing of infant girls. They built industry, railroads, telegraph lines, and irrigation works. India, with its hundreds of languages and dialects, became united under one shared language, English. But the British could not stop the overpopulation. Locals could not compete with British goods. Poverty, already a problem, had gotten worse, and so Hindus and Muslims formed nationalist movements. In China, the Manchu dynasty was in decline. Overpopulation and insufficient food brought discontent and rebellion, and Europe was watching. Now, Europe had been trading with China for quite a while, and industrialization had increased. Trade had gone up. In 1839, the British would trade opium for Chinese tea and silk. Now, opium was illegal at the time, but China really didn't enforce those laws until 1839, when a Cantonese official destroyed the British opium, and thus began a 3-year Opium War, which ended in 1842 with the Treaty of Nanking, where Britain gained Hong Kong and a few trade port cities. Unfortunately, during the Opium Wars, the magnificent palace of Beijing was destroyed by Western forces. Russia began to intrude, and it gained control of the seacoast north of Korea. France took Indochina, which is Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia today. The British seized Burma, and to make things worse, Japan began intruding on the Korean peninsula. War between China and Japan broke out in 1894. In the process, Korea gained independence, and Japan acquired the islands of Formosa and the Pescadores Island. So China had become weak. Now, the United States, with its open-door policy, got equal trade agreements with China. And then Germany controlled the Shantung Peninsula. The Chinese resented the foreigners, and revolutionary movements began to spread. Now, for centuries, Japan had an emperor, a Mikado, and it relied on feudalism and the military. Now, the military leader was called a shogun. Now, the Tokugawa clan won control of the shogunate. They kicked out the foreigners along with the missionaries, banned Christianity, and under the Tokugawas, Japan had a long, peaceful period of prosperity. But prosperity sat mostly with the samurai and the nobility. The peasants suffered, and peasant uprisings broke out. In the 1850s, American Commodore Matthew Perry was sent to Japan to make trade agreements. He succeeded, and 2 ports were opened. Soon, other countries made similar trade agreements. Emperor Mutsuhito began the modernization of Japan. He adopted European models to reorganize the military and the education system. He increased industry very, very quickly. Too quickly. Sanitation and medical services improved, but the population grew, and with that, Japan needed more resources. And so, as mentioned, Japan went to war with China and acquired territories. But then Russia intervened, and Japan went to war with Russia over Korea and Manchuria. And to everyone's surprise, Japan won. For the first time in modern history, an Asian country defeated a European nation. So Japan had regained some land that it had previously lost, and it annexed Korea and became a first-class power. But Russia did build up its settlements in Siberia, and it got permission from China to build a Trans-Siberian Railroad through Manchuria, and it also divided its properties in Persia with the British. Now, the Pacific Islands had fallen victim to Europe and the United States. Germany and France would take New Guinea, the Marshall Islands, and Tahiti. The Dutch would take the East Indies. Now, the U.S. attempted to annex Hawaii, but they met resistance from Queen Liliuokalani, but she was overthrown in 1893. Hawaii was annexed 5 years later and would later become a state. The U.S. would also acquire the Philippines, and it would build military bases in Guam. Africa. Africa fell victim to imperialism amazingly fast. In 1875, Europe controlled 10% of Africa, but in 20 years, it would control 90%. What happened? Well, for starters, the Turks lost some of its power in the Ottoman Empire. France, seeing an opportunity, invaded Algeria in 1830, and France began building a canal in the Isthmus of Suez in 1869. And just by looking at this map, you can see the importance that a canal would have. A canal in the Isthmus of Suez would connect Europe through the Mediterranean into the Red Sea and to the oceans beyond. Now, a Turkish governor of Egypt named Ismail Pasha owned many shares in the Suez Canal Company. But because he was heavily in debt, he sold his shares to the British government. And the British were very interested because the canal would be a waterway to its territories in India, Australia, and New Zealand. And after some warfare, Britain took over Egypt and the Sudan. And the British government sent out many explorers, such as Richard Burton, John Speke, David Livingstone, and Henry Stanley. Henry Stanley, with the help of the King of Belgium, Leopold II, founded the International Congo Association. Stanley visited 400 native chiefs in the Congo and traded trinkets and some goods in exchange for their marks on bits of paper. He had fooled them into signing contracts that were ceding all of the land over to Belgium, and by 1908, it was known as the Belgium Congo. Now, I could go on with story after story, but let's just say that Africa was divided up by France, Italy, Britain, Germany, Portugal, Belgium, and Spain. Now, the Europeans abolished slavery. They put down a lot of tribal warfare, built cities, railroads, and industries. But they also exploited the natives, uprooted them from their lands, tortured, and executed them. And King Leopold II of Belgium was especially ruthless. He had many mines and factories and workers in rubber and so forth. And the natives had to reach a daily quota. And if you didn't reach the daily quota, you had your hands amputated. Even children, some as young as 5. Now, how many died under King Leopold II? Nobody really knows. Many died of smallpox. But the number's probably about 10 million. Latin America had many resources: rubber, platinum, gold, silver, oil, copper, gas. But the governments were very corrupt. Now, you may remember one of my past videos on Simón Bolívar and how he, the liberator of South America, wanted to unite the South American countries in order to defend the continent against the Europeans. Now, he had failed. But the United States, under James Monroe, who wrote out the Monroe Doctrine, said that it would intervene against Europe if they got involved in South America. However, the United States itself would intervene in Latin countries. Cuba and Puerto Rico were the last Latin American territories of the Spanish Empire. When they broke out into revolution, the U.S. came aboard to help, along with Colonel Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. The U.S. would annex Puerto Rico. Cuba would defeat Spain. The U.S. would impose restrictions on Cuba, but it would give up its rights of intervention in 1934. However, the U.S. still retains a naval base in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, today. Now, for centuries, the world had entertained the notion of building a canal through today's Isthmus of Panama to unite the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. Even a railroad was built to cross this little area. Now, Theodore Roosevelt tried to make a deal with Colombia to build the canal. Colombia got a little bit difficult in negotiations, so Theodore Roosevelt helped some rebels fight against the Colombians and form the new Republic of Panama. Panama then, in turn, made a deal with the United States, and Theodore Roosevelt, who swore to dig the canal with his bare hands if he had to, started the project, and thus came the Panama Canal. The U.S. would also intercede in Dominican Republic, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Honduras. And then later on, throughout the 20th century, the United States would intervene in elections, civil wars, and revolutions throughout Latin America. But we're not going to go there right now. We're going to look at the world at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, when all this imperialism had created many national interests, international interests, and rivalries. It was a powder keg, dynamite, waiting to explode. And we're going to examine all of this in our next video, World War I. But in the meantime, this is Cool Talk. Subscribe, send your comments below. Thanks for watching.